This is a moment where we have lots of opportunities in our lives to use this rethinking stress concept. This time that we're living through has been called the Great Reset. And the question is not just about how we adjust to this new normal time, rather, it's about how we make the present better than ever before. It's an opportunity, not a threat to our systems. And this next slide I want to show you is probably one of my favorite slides of the entire pandemic. I remember when the news about the pandemic hit, I was actually out of the country with my family. And when I heard about the level 4 travel restrictions, I immediately sunk into the fear zone. I started researching about COVID. I was really irritable. I did do a little bit of panic buying, mostly for N95 masks. I think that there were a lot of reactions that we can all relate to that came out of a sense of fear. And as the pandemic has gone on, I began to recognize that there were other spheres out there, the learning zone, the growth zone. And where I want to be is the growth zone. And some days I slide up and down along that continuum from growth zone to fear zone to learning zone, depending on what's going on in the world. But I think that when you begin to recognize that you have the capacity to choose where you fit in this chart, it changes everything. So this is our moment for great reset. And the more that we can rethink our stress, the more that we'll begin to experience the fullness of fearless positivity. So the second strategy is to optimize your mindset. Optimize your mindset. So when I start talking about mindset and happiness and optimism, sometimes people get a little bit of the wrong idea. And so I always like to start off by talking and defining what I mean by happiness. And specifically, I'm thinking back to this moment when my brother Sean Acor and I had been driving. We had been at an event in California, and it was a CEO in Silicon Valley who became really enamored with this idea of bringing positive psychology to his company. Was asking us to do some consulting around some culture change in his organization. And my brother and I needed desperately to get to the airport, and so we said, "I'm so sorry. Maybe we can continue this conversation. We've got to get to the airport." And the CEO said, "Oh, don't worry. I'll drive you and we can talk on the way." We thought, fantastic, this is great. So we hopped in the car with him, and he must have taken it really seriously that we were going to be late, because he took off, zoomed down the road, swerving in and out of the traffic. And the entire time, the seatbelt dinger was going off in the car. And finally, my brother turned to the CEO and he's like, I just have to ask you, you don't wear a seatbelt?" And the CEO said, "Oh no, I've read your books. I love your research. I'm an optimist." And we thought, oh no. Optimism, while it's great for so many things, cannot stop cars from hitting you. That's what we call irrational optimism. And my hope is that you do not walk away from here today with the sense that we're talking about that. What we actually want to talk about is what I define as rational optimism. It starts with realism, not rose-colored glasses, and it's looking at the world with the lens of choice. It's looking at a lens of saying, I have the ability to decide how I want to act, and I believe that my behavior matters, and so I choose X, Y, or Z. Now, I know in the last week in the news, there's been a lot of talk about toxic positivity and how much we have a sense that we might want to move beyond things that are causing us discomfort or frustration in the world. And there's a sense that in order to be positive, you almost have to stick your head in the sand and ignore what's going on in the world. That's not what we're talking about here either. What I really want you to focus on is your mindset, your way of looking at the world. And it's looking at the world with realism, and then choosing your behavior after you've seen the good and the bad by giving a slight preference to the positive. Because what we know from research is that appreciative inquiry begins to help us by looking at what we do have, not what we don't have in our lives. And when we look at what we do have, you begin to see more opportunities in your space. So for instance, we've all heard of someone saying, do you see the cup as half full or half empty? Meaning, are you an optimist or are you a pessimist? And I like to say that I've moved beyond this question, because it doesn't actually matter if you see the cup as half full or half empty. if you have an entire pitcher of water sitting right beside you that you can refill that cup with at any moment. This reservoir of optimism comes deeper than just the moment of being positive or negative. It's a way of being and thinking. And the reason why in positive psychology we like to study what's called positive outliers is because if you study what's average, if you were to say, Amy, how many Advil should I take? You read the back of the bottle and say, oh, Amy, well, the average person should take 2 tablets of 200 milligrams. That's the average dose. That works for medicine, but when we're talking about optimism, that same question doesn't apply, because what we find is that if you study what's merely average, you remain merely average. But if you can begin to look at some of the positive outliers, those people who are way off the chart in terms of optimism, and you study what it is that they're doing in their lives that makes such a difference, what you begin to recognize is that there's some habits that they're using to optimize mindset. And that's what the entire field of positive psychology is about, is studying what are those mindset habits and how can we replicate them to put them into practice in our own lives. And so we get there by recognizing that a positive mindset is one of the best advantages we have in the modern economy. Many of you probably don't know this, but 50% of the Fortune 500 companies that we have today actually came out of the recession of the 1980s. So that the recession of the 1980s became kind of this bifurcated path, just like we saw with that tree at the very beginning that I showed you, that those individuals who can rise above, who can find that spirit of optimism to prevail and to be resilient, are the very individuals and companies that succeed in the long run. And not only do they succeed, but they're happier doing so.